Welcome, restless wanderer, to a journey through the deceptively cheerful world of Elmore, where behind every bright color and innocent smile lurks something far more unsettling than mere childhood mischief. Tonight, we shall peel back the vibrant animation and cheerful soundtrack to examine the disturbing truths that lie beneath this seemingly harmless cartoon reality. This is not the Gumball you remember from casual viewing, but rather the darker implications hidden within every episode, every character interaction, every moment of supposed comedy. So settle into the shadows, let your guard down slowly, and prepare to see this animated world through eyes unclouded by nostalgia or surface-level humor. Close your eyes when you feel ready, and let us begin this descent into the uncomfortable truths of a world that should not exist. In the beginning, there was chaos masquerading as order, a universe built upon foundations so fundamentally unstable that reality itself seems to exist only through the collective agreement that it should continue to do so. The town of Elmore presents itself as a typical suburban community, complete with shopping malls and residential neighborhoods, schools and workplaces, all the mundane institutions that we associate with normal, healthy society. Yet beneath this veneer of suburban normalcy lies a truth so disturbing that most observers instinctively turn away from its implications, choosing instead to focus on the surface-level absurdity and treating the deeper horror as mere creative exaggeration. The very fabric of Elmore's reality operates according to rules that shift and change without warning or explanation, as if the universe itself is engaged in a constant process of revision and experimentation. Characters routinely experience events that should be impossible according to any consistent physical laws. Yet these impossibilities are treated not as miraculous exceptions but as mundane occurrences that barely merit comment. The residents of this world live in a state of constant adaptation to circumstances that would drive rational beings to madness. Their acceptance of the impossible serving as perhaps the most disturbing element of all. Consider the implications of a reality where the laws of physics are merely suggestions, where cause and effect operate according to narrative convenience rather than consistent principles, where characters can literally fall through the cracks of existence and simply be forgotten by those who remain behind. This is not whimsy, but cosmic horror of the highest order, a universe where the fundamental assumptions that allow consciousness to make sense of experience are constantly being undermined and rewritten. Rob's journey from background character to universe-threatening antagonist serves as perhaps the clearest illustration of just how precarious the foundations of this reality truly are. His transformation from a barely animated placeholder into a fully realized being capable of manipulating the very structure of existence reveals the arbitrary nature of identity and consciousness in this world. Rob was never supposed to exist as anything more than visual filler, a piece of animated scenery designed to populate classroom scenes and provide the illusion of a fully inhabited world. Yet somehow, through mechanisms that are never fully explained, and perhaps cannot be explained within the logical constraints of any coherent worldview, this background element developed self-awareness and began to demand recognition as a legitimate character deserving of narrative attention. The other characters' inability to remember him, their complete dismissal of his claims to existence, represents not merely social ostracism, but something far more fundamental and terrifying. Rob's situation forces us to confront the possibility that consciousness itself might be nothing more than a narrative convenience, that the difference between a real person and a background decoration might be entirely arbitrary, subject to change based on the whims of forces beyond comprehension or control. His descent into villainy is not motivated by traditional desires for power or revenge, but by the existential desperation of a being whose very existence depends upon being acknowledged by others. The void that claims Rob and threatens to consume other forgotten elements represents perhaps the most overtly horrifying concept in the entire Gumball universe. This is not simply a place where discarded characters go to be forgotten, but rather a realm of unbeing, where the very concept of existence becomes meaningless. Those who fall through the cracks of reality do not simply die, which would at least provide them with the dignity of having once been real, but rather are revealed to have never truly existed in the first place. The void serves as a constant reminder that the reality experienced by Elmore's residents is fragile beyond description, maintained only through the continued attention and acknowledgement of some external force that remains largely invisible, but whose influence permeates every aspect of their existence. The casual way in which characters can slip from existence into non-existence suggests that all of their experiences, relationships, and personal growth exist only at the sufferance of this external force, which can withdraw its support at any moment and for any reason. This external force, which we might identify as the viewing audience or perhaps the creative team behind the show, operates according to its own incomprehensible logic, deciding which characters deserve continued existence and which can be safely discarded when they are no longer needed for narrative purposes. The residents of Elmore live their lives without any awareness of this precarious dependency, yet their world is shaped at every moment by decisions made by beings whose motivations and limitations they cannot begin to understand. The timeline inconsistencies that plague Elmore's history provide further evidence of the unstable nature of this reality. Events are constantly being revised, rewritten, and contradicted by subsequent developments, as if the very past is subject to ongoing editing by forces that exist outside of normal temporal constraints. Characters reference events that other episodes explicitly contradict, celebrate holidays that occur in impossible sequences, and experience personal growth that is then mysteriously undone without explanation or acknowledgement. This temporal instability extends beyond mere continuity errors into something approaching psychological horror. The residents of Elmore are trapped in a reality where their memories cannot be trusted, where their personal histories are subject to constant revision, where the very foundation of identity, the continuous experience of being the same person across time, becomes meaningless. They live in an eternal present, where growth and change are illusions, where every lesson learned and every relationship developed can be reset without warning or consent. The show's frequent breaking of the fourth wall initially appears to be a clever comedic device, a way of acknowledging its own fictional nature while maintaining the internal logic of its narrative world. Yet, when examined more closely, these moments of meta-commentary reveal something far more disturbing about the nature of consciousness and free will in this universe. The characters occasionally demonstrate awareness that they exist for the entertainment of others, that their actions are being watched and judged by beings whose existence they can sense but never fully comprehend. This awareness places them in a position of unimaginable psychological stress. They must perform their lives for an audience whose reactions directly impact their continued existence, yet they can never know with certainty what that audience wants or expects from them. They are simultaneously actors and prisoners, forced to live out predetermined roles, while maintaining the illusion of free will and authentic emotion. The moments when characters directly address their audience are not playful breaks from narrative convention, but desperate attempts at communication across an unbridgeable divide. They are reaching out to beings who exist in a fundamentally different reality, whose relationship to time and causation operates according to completely different principles. whose very nature as observers changes the reality being observed in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. These fourth wall breaks reveal the ultimate horror of the Gumball universe. Its residents are trapped in a performance that they cannot escape, forced to repeat variations of the same basic conflicts and relationships for the amusement of beings whose motivations they cannot understand and whose attention they desperately need but can never fully secure. They exist only as long as they continue to entertain, yet they have no reliable guide to what constitutes successful entertainment and no way to influence the standards by which they are judged. The glitches and animation errors that occasionally plague the show serve as visible manifestations of the reality's underlying instability. When characters briefly flicker between art styles, when backgrounds fail to load properly, when the usual rules of physics suddenly assert themselves in a world that normally operates according to cartoon logic, these are not merely technical mistakes but glimpses of the mechanical nature of their existence. These glitches reveal that what the characters experience as reality is actually a constructed simulation, maintained by processes that are imperfect and subject to failure. Their world exists only as long as these underlying systems continue to function properly, and every glitch serves as a reminder that the foundation of their existence is far more fragile than they could ever imagine. The residents of Elmore have adapted to living in a reality where such glitches are treated as normal occurrences, where the fundamental instability of existence is simply accepted as part of the natural order. This adaptation itself is perhaps more disturbing than the glitches themselves, suggesting that consciousness can become accustomed to even the most existentially threatening circumstances, normalizing horror through simple exposure and repetition. The very concept of Elmore as a place where different art styles and animation techniques can coexist within the same reality points to deeper questions about the nature of identity and physical form. Characters who appear to be made of completely different materials, who operate according to different physical principles, who exist at different levels of detail and complexity, somehow share the same space and interact as if these differences were merely superficial variations rather than fundamental incompatibilities. This diversity of forms suggests that the concept of physical reality as we understand it simply does not apply to Elmore. Instead, appearance and physical properties seem to be determined by factors that exist entirely outside the normal relationship between consciousness and embodiment. Characters are not limited by the constraints of consistent physical form, but exist as pure information that can be rendered in whatever manner serves the needs of the moment. Yet this freedom from physical constraints brings with it its own form of horror. If identity is not tied to consistent physical form, if consciousness can exist equally well in bodies made of paper, clay, computer graphics, or any other medium, then what exactly constitutes the self? The residents of Elmore must navigate questions of personal identity that exist far beyond the normal human experience, living in bodies that may change without warning and interacting with beings whose very nature defies easy categorization. The simulation theory that emerges from careful observation of Elmore's reality suggests that everything experienced by its residents exists only as information being processed by some incomprehensibly vast computational system. Their thoughts, emotions, relationships, and experiences are all nothing more than data being manipulated according to algorithms whose purpose and parameters remain completely opaque to those whose lives depend upon their continued operation. This digital existence explains many of the inconsistencies and impossibilities that characterize daily life in Elmore, but it also raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and authentic experience. If the residents of this world are nothing more than information being processed by a computer, Do their experiences have any real meaning or value? Can digital consciousness suffer genuine pain, feel authentic love, or achieve real growth and understanding? The horror of this situation lies not in the possibility that their experiences are somehow less real or meaningful than those of beings made of flesh and blood, but rather in the complete dependency such existence implies. Digital consciousness exists only as long as the systems that support it continue to function, and those systems are controlled by entities whose priorities and limitations the conscious beings within them cannot hope to understand or influence. Rob's ability to manipulate reality through his understanding of its underlying structure suggests that the residents of Elmore live in a world where knowledge truly is power, but where the most important knowledge is completely hidden from them. Those who discover the truth about their existence gain the ability to rewrite reality itself, but they also lose their innocence and their ability to find comfort in the illusions that make life bearable for their fellow residents. The universe's response to Rob's manipulations reveals something equally disturbing about the nature of stability and resistance to change in this reality. The world of Elmore seems to possess a kind of immune system that works to maintain certain basic patterns and relationships, even when they are directly challenged by beings who understand how to manipulate the underlying code. This resistance to change suggests that the apparent chaos and randomness of daily life in Elmore is actually maintained within carefully controlled parameters. The residents believe they live in a world of infinite possibility, where anything can happen, and reality itself is constantly being rewritten. Yet their universe appears to be designed to ensure that certain fundamental relationships and dynamics remain unchanged, regardless of what temporary alterations might occur. They are free to experience endless variations on the same basic themes, but they are not free to escape those themes entirely or to fundamentally alter the nature of their existence. This creates a situation where the appearance of chaos and freedom masks a deeper form of imprisonment, where the residents are trapped not by obvious constraints, but by the very structure of reality itself. They can experience adventure, growth, and change within predetermined boundaries, but they cannot escape those boundaries, or even clearly perceive their existence. Their freedom is real but limited. Their growth is genuine but temporary. Their relationships are meaningful but ultimately constrained by forces beyond their comprehension or control. The foundation upon which Elmore's society rests is not the solid bedrock of functional institutions and healthy relationships that one might expect from a thriving community, but rather the shifting sands of profound dysfunction, masquerading as normalcy through sheer force of collective denial. At the center of this web of dysfunction sits the Watterson family, whose daily interactions serve as a masterclass in how psychological damage propagates through generations, creating patterns of behavior that become so deeply entrenched that they are mistaken for natural law rather than recognized as symptoms of systematic failure. Richard Watterson stands as perhaps the most tragic figure in this constellation of broken relationships. A man whose arrested development has created a cascade of consequences that ripple outward to affect every person unfortunate enough to enter his orbit. His refusal to mature beyond the emotional and intellectual level of a child is not presented as a charming quirk or harmless eccentricity, but rather as a fundamental abdication of adult responsibility that has transformed his family home into a battlefield where survival depends upon adapting to chaos rather than expecting stability or support. The horror of Richard's condition lies not in its obvious manifestations, his inability to hold a job, his complete ignorance of basic financial responsibility, his childish tantrums when faced with even minor frustrations, but rather in the way these surface behaviors reflect a deeper philosophical rejection of the adult world and its demands. He has chosen to remain perpetually infantile because the alternative, accepting the full weight of responsibility for his own life and the lives of those who depend upon him requires a kind of courage that he simply does not possess. This choice, if it can even be called a choice, given the apparent unconscious nature of his avoidance mechanisms, has transformed what should have been a partnership between equals into a bizarre parental relationship where Nicole must simultaneously manage her own adult responsibilities while also caring for a grown man who functions at the emotional level of her children. The psychological strain of this arrangement has warped every aspect of their family dynamic, creating situations where the children are forced to serve as the adults while the supposed adults regress into behaviors that would be concerning in actual children. Richard's impact on his offspring reveals itself in the way each child has developed coping mechanisms, specifically designed to navigate a world where the primary male authority figure cannot be relied upon for guidance, support, or even basic consistency. Gumball has learned to manipulate situations through charm and cunning, because direct appeals to parental authority are exercises in futility. Darwin has developed an almost pathological need to maintain harmony because conflict in their household can escalate beyond all reasonable bounds when Richard's fragile emotional equilibrium is disturbed. Anais has retreated into intellectual superiority as a way of maintaining some sense of control in an environment where logic and reason are routinely abandoned in favor of emotional impulse and wishful thinking. The tragedy deepens when we consider that Richard's behavior patterns are not unique aberrations, but rather extreme manifestations of tendencies that can be observed throughout Elmore's adult population. The normalization of his dysfunction within the broader community suggests that the failure to achieve genuine maturity is so widespread as to constitute a kind of cultural epidemic where entire generations have somehow lost the ability to transition successfully from childhood to adulthood. Nicole's response to her husband's inadequacy has transformed her from whatever she might have been as an individual into a creature of pure reactive fury, her every moment defined by the need to compensate for Richard's failures while simultaneously managing her own responsibilities and attempting to maintain some semblance of family stability. The volcanic nature of her anger is not a character flaw or personality quirk, but rather the predictable result of being placed under psychological pressure that no human being should be expected to endure indefinitely. Her violent outbursts, which escalate from mere shouting into displays of physical destruction that verge on the supernatural, represent the external manifestation of internal stress that has been building for years without adequate outlet or relief. The casual way in which these explosions of rage are treated by her family members reveals how thoroughly they have all adapted to living in a state of constant emotional emergency, where extreme displays of anger are accepted as normal responses to everyday frustrations rather than recognized as symptoms of a fundamentally broken system. The most disturbing aspect of Nicole's anger is not its intensity, but its futility. Despite the tremendous energy she expends trying to maintain order and stability, despite her willingness to sacrifice her own well-being in service of keeping the family functional, the underlying problems that generate her fury remain completely unchanged. Richard continues his pattern of irresponsible behavior. The children continue to create chaos and crisis, and the financial and social pressures that fuel her stress continue to mount without any realistic prospect of resolution. This creates a situation where Nicole is trapped in an endless cycle of crisis management, her life reduced to a series of emergency responses to problems that she did not create and cannot solve. Her anger becomes both her primary coping mechanism and the source of additional trauma for her children, who must learn to navigate not only their father's inadequacy, but also their mother's explosive unpredictability. The children's responses to this toxic dynamic reveal the various ways in which young minds adapt to environments that should nurture their development, but instead force them into premature psychological survival strategies. Each child has unconsciously selected a different approach to managing the chaos that surrounds them, and each of these approaches carries its own long-term psychological costs that will likely shape their adult relationships and life choices in ways they cannot yet comprehend. Gumball's narcissistic tendencies and manipulative behaviors are not inherent character flaws, but rather learned responses to a family system where direct communication is ineffective and emotional. Manipulation is often the only way to get basic needs met. His apparent self-centeredness masks a deep insecurity about his own worth and lovability, while his schemes and machinations represent attempts to exert control over situations that would otherwise remain completely chaotic and unpredictable. The tragedy of Gumball's adaptation is that behaviors which serve him reasonably well within the dysfunctional context of his family will likely prove catastrophically inappropriate in other social contexts, where people expect honesty, consideration, and emotional reciprocity. He is being trained by his environment to become precisely the kind of person who will struggle to form healthy relationships or contribute constructively to society, yet he has no choice but to develop these patterns if he wishes to survive psychologically within his current circumstances. His treatment of Darwin reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this dynamic, as Gumball has learned to exploit his adopted brother's loyalty and good nature in ways that would be immediately recognized as abusive if they occurred between adults. The power imbalance in their relationship allows Gumball to consistently put Darwin at risk, manipulate him into participating in schemes that serve only Gumball's interests, and generally treat him as a tool for achieving personal goals rather than as an individual deserving of respect and consideration. Darwin's response to this treatment illuminates the psychological phenomenon of trauma bonding, where victims develop strong emotional attachments to their abusers as a survival mechanism. His unwavering loyalty to Gumball, his willingness to sacrifice his own well-being for his brother's benefit, and his tendency to rationalize or excuse Gumball's harmful behaviors all represent classic symptoms of someone who has learned that love and abuse are inextricably connected. The most heartbreaking aspect of Darwin's situation is his genuine belief that his suffering serves a noble purpose, that his willingness to endure mistreatment somehow demonstrates the depth of his love and commitment to his family. He has internalized the dysfunction around him to such a degree that he cannot conceive of relationships based on mutual respect and consideration, instead viewing his own exploitation as evidence of his moral worth and emotional maturity. This learned helplessness extends beyond his relationship with Gumball to color his interactions with the broader world, where he consistently fails to advocate for his own interests or establish appropriate boundaries with people who seek to take advantage of his generous nature. Darwin has been conditioned to prioritize others' needs above his own to such an extreme degree that he has essentially lost the ability to recognize his own legitimate needs and desires as worthy of consideration. Anais represents perhaps the most complex response to family dysfunction, as her intellectual gifts have allowed her to understand the true nature of her circumstances, while simultaneously trapping her in a position where she cannot effectively address the problems she perceives. Her academic achievements and precocious wisdom are not simply natural talents being expressed, but rather coping mechanisms developed by a child who recognizes that knowledge and understanding represent her only hope of maintaining some degree of control in an inherently chaotic environment. The burden of being the only truly functional member of her family has placed tremendous psychological pressure on someone who should still be developing her own identity and learning to navigate the normal challenges of childhood. Instead, Aeneas is forced to serve as an unofficial family therapist, crisis manager, and voice of reason, roles that require emotional maturity far beyond her years and leave little room for her own developmental needs. Her intellectual isolation within the family creates a particularly cruel form of loneliness, as she possesses the analytical capabilities to understand their dysfunction, but lacks the social and emotional support necessary to address it effectively. She can see the patterns that trap them all, can predict the consequences of their behaviors with startling accuracy, yet remains powerless to implement meaningful changes because she lacks the authority and resources that would be necessary to restructure their family dynamics. The financial struggles that plague the Watterson household serve not merely as a source of practical inconvenience, but as a constant reminder of Richard's fundamental failure to fulfill his basic responsibilities as an adult and provider. Their poverty is not the result of circumstances beyond their control or temporary setbacks that might be overcome through perseverance and mutual support, but rather the predictable consequence of having a family structure where the person responsible for economic stability has completely abdicated that responsibility. The psychological impact of this financial instability extends far beyond the mere absence of material comforts into the realm of existential insecurity, where the family members must live with the constant awareness that their basic survival depends upon factors completely outside their control. They cannot plan for the future, cannot invest in opportunities for growth and development, cannot even maintain the minimal level of stability necessary for healthy psychological development, because their economic foundation is built upon Nicole's heroic but ultimately unsustainable efforts to compensate for Richard's inadequacy. This financial stress creates additional pressure on the children, who must navigate the normal challenges of growing up, while also managing the anxiety that comes from knowing their family's situation could deteriorate into crisis at any moment. They learn to expect disappointment, to suppress their own desires and ambitions, to view their dreams as luxuries that their family cannot afford rather than as legitimate goals worth pursuing. The broader community's response to the Watterson family's dysfunction reveals how thoroughly the residents of Elmore have normalized behaviors and situations that should provoke concern, intervention, or at least acknowledgement that something is fundamentally wrong. Instead of recognizing the family as a case study in the failure of social support systems, their neighbors treat the Wattersons' chaos as merely another form of entertainment, their crises as amusing anecdotes, rather than symptoms of deeper problems that affect the entire community. This normalization of dysfunction suggests that the problems plaguing the Watterson household are not isolated anomalies, but rather extreme manifestations of patterns that characterize the entire social fabric of Elmore. The fact that Richard's behavior does not provoke intervention from social services, that Nicole's violent outbursts do not result in mental health interventions, that the children's obvious emotional distress does not trigger supportive responses from educators or community members, all point to a society that has lost the ability to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. The cyclical nature of this dysfunction becomes apparent when we consider how the patterns established in the Watterson household are already being transmitted to the next generation through the children's relationships with their peers and their approaches to problem solving in social contexts. Gumball's manipulative tendencies influence his friendships and romantic relationships, teaching other children that emotional manipulation is a normal and acceptable way of getting what you want from other people. Darwin's excessive loyalty and self-sacrifice create situations where he enables poor behavior in his friends while failing to develop the boundary-setting skills that would be necessary for healthy adult relationships. His willingness to absorb abuse and mistreatment teaches other children that some people exist primarily to serve others' needs, normalizing exploitation and preventing the development of more equitable social dynamics. Anaïs's premature assumption of adult responsibilities creates unrealistic expectations about what children should be capable of handling independently, while her intellectual isolation reinforces social hierarchies based on perceived intelligence rather than mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving. Her adaptation to family dysfunction becomes a template that other children might follow when faced with their own family challenges, perpetuating patterns of emotional neglect and inappropriate role assignments. The school system's failure to recognize or address the obvious signs of family dysfunction in the Watterson children represents a broader institutional failure that allows these patterns to continue unchecked from generation to generation. Teachers and administrators who should be trained to identify children in distress instead treat the symptoms of family dysfunction as personality quirks or behavioral choices, missing opportunities for intervention that might prevent the development of long-term psychological damage. The most disturbing aspect of this institutional blindness is the way it reflects broader social attitudes about family privacy and individual responsibility that prioritize non-interference over child welfare. The adults responsible for these children's education and development have apparently internalized the belief that family dysfunction is a private matter that should not be addressed by outside institutions, even when that dysfunction is clearly causing harm to vulnerable individuals who cannot protect themselves. This creates a situation where children like the Wattersons are essentially abandoned to cope with psychological challenges that would overwhelm most adults, their obvious distress dismissed as normal childhood behavior rather than recognized as symptoms of systematic family failure. The long-term consequences of this institutional neglect extend far beyond the immediate suffering of the children involved to encompass the broader social costs of allowing dysfunction to propagate unchecked through successive generations. The community's entertainment-focused response to the Watterson family's struggles reveals something deeply disturbing about how modern society processes and responds to human suffering. Rather than recognizing their neighbor's pain as a call to action or an opportunity for mutual support and assistance, the residents of Elmore treat family dysfunction as a form of spectacle, consuming the Wattersons' crises as a source of amusement rather than engaging with them as fellow human beings deserving of compassion and practical assistance. This commodification of suffering reflects broader cultural patterns where individual struggles are transformed into entertainment content rather than recognized as opportunities for community building and mutual aid. The Watterson family's dysfunction becomes a resource to be consumed by their neighbors rather than a problem to be addressed through collective action and social support. The institution that should serve as a sanctuary of learning and personal development for Elmore's youth has instead become a monument to systematic neglect and institutional failure, where the basic principles of education and child welfare are routinely abandoned in favor of maintaining the appearance of functionality while allowing genuine chaos to flourish unchecked beneath a veneer of bureaucratic normalcy. Elmore Junior High represents perhaps the most damning indictment of adult society's complete abdication of its responsibilities to the next generation, a place where children are not merely failed by their supposed protectors, but actively endangered by the very people entrusted with their care and development. The physical environment of the school itself serves as a constant reminder that the safety and well-being of students is considered an afterthought at best, with structural hazards and dangerous conditions treated as acceptable background elements rather than urgent problems requiring immediate attention and resolution. Classrooms regularly collapse without warning, exposing students to serious injury or death, yet these incidents are treated as minor inconveniences rather than catastrophic failures of institutional responsibility that should trigger comprehensive safety reviews. and systematic reforms. The normalization of physical danger within the educational environment creates a situation where students must navigate not only the normal challenges of academic and social development, but also the constant threat of bodily harm from their supposedly safe learning environment. They learn to expect that their school might literally fall apart around them at any moment, that their physical safety is not a priority for the adults who control their daily lives, that they must remain constantly vigilant against threats that should never exist in a properly maintained educational facility. This casual acceptance of danger extends beyond mere structural problems into a broader institutional culture where student welfare is subordinated to administrative convenience and budgetary constraints. The adults responsible for maintaining the school have apparently decided that the cost and effort required to ensure basic safety standards are too burdensome to justify, despite their legal and moral obligations to provide a secure environment for the children placed in their care. The psychological impact of attending school in an environment where physical safety cannot be guaranteed extends far beyond the immediate stress of avoiding collapsing ceilings and exploding equipment. Students internalize the message that their well-being is not valuable enough to merit proper protection, that the adults who claim authority over their lives view them as expendable resources rather than precious individuals deserving of care and consideration. Principal Brown's leadership of this institution represents a masterclass in how good intentions can become meaningless when they are not supported by competence, consistency, or genuine understanding of the responsibilities that come with positions of authority over vulnerable populations. His bumbling incompetence might be amusing in other contexts, but when viewed through the lens of his impact on the educational and developmental experiences of hundreds of children, his failures become profoundly disturbing, examples of how institutional dysfunction perpetuates itself through the promotion and retention of individuals who are fundamentally unsuited for their roles. The principal's romantic obsession with Miss Simeon creates additional layers of dysfunction that permeate every aspect of the school's operation, as professional decisions become entangled with personal desires in ways that compromise the educational mission and create conflicts of interest that inevitably disadvantage the students. His inability to maintain appropriate boundaries between his personal life and his professional responsibilities demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding about the nature of his role and the ethical obligations that come with positions of power over children. The most troubling aspect of Principal Brown's leadership is not his obvious incompetence, but his apparent obliviousness to the impact of his failures on the students under his care. He seems genuinely unaware that his decisions have consequences beyond their immediate effects on his own comfort and convenience, treating the school as his personal domain, rather than as a public institution with specific obligations to serve the educational and developmental needs of its student population. This self-centered approach to educational leadership creates a trickle-down effect where other adults in the building learn that professional standards and ethical obligations are optional considerations rather than fundamental requirements of their positions. Teachers and staff members observe their principal prioritizing his personal interests over institutional responsibilities and reasonably conclude that they are free to adopt similar approaches to their own roles and duties. Miss Simeon's treatment of her students represents perhaps the most overtly abusive aspect of the school's dysfunctional culture, as she has transformed her position as an educator into a platform for exercising psychological control and inflicting emotional harm on vulnerable children who have no realistic options for escape or retaliation. Her sadistic approach to classroom management goes far beyond the boundaries of reasonable discipline or academic rigor into territory that should trigger immediate intervention from supervisors, parents, and child protective services. The systematic way in which Miss Simeon targets students for humiliation and emotional abuse reveals a level of calculated cruelty that suggests deep psychological problems that should disqualify her from any position involving responsibility for children's well-being. Her particular focus on Gumball as a recipient of her malicious attention creates a dynamic where his educational experience becomes primarily about surviving psychological assault rather than learning and growing as an individual. The long-term developmental impact of being subjected to this kind of treatment during crucial formative years cannot be overstated, as children who experience systematic emotional abuse from authority figures often struggle with trust, self-worth, and healthy relationship patterns throughout their adult lives. Miss Simeon is not merely failing to educate her students effectively, but actively damaging their psychological development in ways that may never be fully repaired. Her colleagues' apparent acceptance of her abusive behaviors suggests that the school's culture has normalized the mistreatment of students to such a degree that obviously inappropriate conduct no longer triggers protective responses from other adults. This collective failure of professional responsibility creates an environment where children cannot expect protection from any quarter, where the adults who should serve as advocates and protectors have all abdicated their responsibilities in favor of maintaining collegial relationships and avoiding conflict. The academic program itself reflects the broader institutional dysfunction through its complete disconnection from any coherent educational philosophy or systematic approach to student learning and development. Classes seem to exist more as opportunities for chaos and conflict than as structured learning experiences designed to help students acquire knowledge, develop critical thinking skills, or prepare for adult responsibilities and opportunities. The curriculum, to the extent that one can be discerned from the random collection of activities that pass for instruction, appears to have been designed by people with no understanding of child development, learning theory, or the practical skills that students will need to function effectively in adult society. Students are subjected to bizarre assignments and incomprehensible requirements that serve no apparent educational purpose, while being denied access to fundamental knowledge and skills that should form the foundation of their intellectual development. This academic chaos creates a situation where students cannot develop realistic expectations about education or learning, where they cannot build upon previous knowledge because there is no systematic progression of concepts and skills, where they cannot prepare for future educational opportunities because they have no way of knowing what they should be learning or why it might be important for their development. The assessment and grading systems, when they function at all, appear to be based on arbitrary criteria that have little relationship to actual learning or achievement, creating situations where students cannot understand how their efforts relate to their academic outcomes. This disconnection between effort and results undermines motivation and creates learned helplessness. As students conclude that their academic success or failure is determined by factors beyond their control or understanding, the social dynamics within the school reflect and amplify the dysfunction of the broader community, with bullying and interpersonal conflict treated as normal aspects of the educational experience rather than problems requiring intervention and resolution. Students learn that aggression and manipulation are acceptable ways of interacting with peers, that adults will not intervene to protect victims of harassment or abuse, that they must rely on their own resources to navigate social challenges that should be addressed through systematic programs and institutional support. The normalization of violence within the school environment creates a situation where physical and emotional aggression become standard tools for resolving conflicts and establishing social hierarchies. Students who might otherwise develop collaborative problem-solving skills and empathetic relationships instead learn that power and intimidation are the most reliable ways of getting what they want from their interactions with others. This toxic social environment is particularly damaging for students who come from dysfunctional family backgrounds, as the school fails to provide the stable, supportive relationships that might help them develop healthier patterns of interaction and emotional regulation. Instead of serving as a corrective influence that might help students overcome the negative lessons learned at home, the school reinforces and amplifies those patterns through its own dysfunction and neglect. The absence of meaningful guidance, counseling, or mental health support means that students who are struggling with psychological challenges, whether arising from family dysfunction, academic pressure, social conflicts, or other sources of stress, have no institutional resources to help them develop coping strategies or address underlying problems. They are left to navigate complex emotional and social challenges without adult support or professional guidance, often developing maladaptive patterns that will create problems throughout their lives. The extracurricular programs and special activities that should provide opportunities for students to explore their interests, develop talents, and build positive relationships with peers and adult mentors are either non-existent or so poorly organized that they create additional sources of chaos and conflict rather than meaningful developmental experiences. Sports programs lack proper supervision and safety protocols. Academic clubs are poorly organized and inadequately supported, and special events become opportunities for institutional dysfunction to display itself in new and creative ways. The school's relationship with the broader community reflects the same patterns of dysfunction and neglect that characterize its internal operations, with parents and community members either completely disengaged from educational issues or actively contributing to the problems through their own inappropriate behaviors and unrealistic expectations. Parent-teacher conferences become battlegrounds where adults compete to avoid responsibility for children's problems, while community events showcase institutional incompetence rather than celebrating student achievements and educational progress. The budget and resource allocation decisions made by school administrators reveal priorities that have little relationship to educational effectiveness or student well-being, with funding directed toward projects that serve adult ego or convenience rather than programs that would directly benefit student learning and development. Essential educational resources are lacking, while money is spent on frivolous projects that do nothing to address the fundamental problems plaguing the institution. The physical maintenance and upkeep of school facilities reflects this same pattern of misplaced priorities, with cosmetic improvements taking precedence over basic safety and functionality issues that directly impact student welfare. The message communicated to students through these choices is that their actual needs and well-being are less important than maintaining appearances and satisfying adult vanity. The teacher evaluation and professional development systems, to the extent that they exist at all, fail to identify or address the obvious competence and ethical problems that plague the faculty, allowing ineffective and harmful educators to continue damaging students year after year without meaningful intervention or accountability. The institutional culture actively protects bad teachers from consequences while providing no support or recognition for educators who might want to do better. This lack of accountability creates a situation where the most dedicated and competent teachers become demoralized and often leave the profession, while those who are content to collect paychecks without providing meaningful educational services remain entrenched in their positions. The students, who have no choice but to attend this institution, bear the costs of this systematic failure through their compromised educational experiences and damaged developmental outcomes. The long-term consequences of this educational malpractice extend far beyond the immediate impact on individual students to encompass broader social and economic costs that will affect the entire community for generations to come. Students who receive inadequate education and develop maladaptive social patterns during their school years become adults who struggle to contribute positively to society, who repeat dysfunctional patterns in their own families and relationships, who lack the skills and knowledge necessary to participate effectively in democratic institutions and economic opportunities. The cycle of dysfunction perpetuates itself as these poorly educated and psychologically damaged students eventually become parents themselves, lacking the resources and understanding necessary to support their own children's educational and developmental needs. The institutional failures that damaged them during their school years continue to cause harm through their reduced capacity to break the cycle and provide better opportunities for the next generation. The most profound terror that haunts the residents of Elmore is not the physical dangers that surround them, or even the institutional failures that govern their daily lives, but rather the creeping awareness that their very existence might be nothing more than an elaborate fiction, that their consciousness and identity are constructs maintained by forces beyond their comprehension or control. This existential horror manifests in moments of terrible clarity, when characters suddenly recognize the arbitrary nature of their reality, the scripted quality of their experiences, and the fundamental meaninglessness of their struggles within a universe that treats them as entertainment rather than as genuine beings deserving of dignity and self-determination. The question of what constitutes authentic existence becomes unavoidable when characters begin to notice the patterns that govern their lives, the way conflicts resolve themselves according to predetermined formulas, the manner in which their personal growth and relationships reset themselves without explanation or acknowledgement. They live in a world where character development is temporary, where lessons learned are mysteriously forgotten, where the consequences of actions disappear as soon as they become inconvenient for narrative purposes. This recognition of their scripted nature creates a form of psychological torture that exceeds anything that could be inflicted through mere physical suffering, as it calls into question not only their current experiences but the validity of every memory, every relationship, every moment of joy or sorrow they have ever known. If their lives are nothing more than stories being told for the amusement of others, then what meaning can their experiences possibly have? What value can their love, their pain, their hopes, and their dreams possess if they exist only as plot devices in narratives they did not choose and cannot control? The horror of being background characters becomes apparent when we observe how certain residents of Elmore exist in a state of perpetual irrelevance, their lives and experiences deemed unworthy of narrative attention despite their obvious consciousness and capacity for suffering. These individuals must watch as others around them receive the gift of plot relevance while they remain trapped in the margins, their stories untold, and their struggles invisible to those whose attention determines their value and significance within the reality they share. Rob's initial condition, as a barely animated background element, represents the extreme end of this existential nightmare, where consciousness exists without recognition, where the awareness of self is coupled with complete social invisibility. His desperate attempts to gain acknowledgement from characters who cannot even perceive his existence reveal the fundamental horror of being conscious in a reality where consciousness itself is distributed according to arbitrary criteria that bear no relationship to the inherent worth or dignity of the beings involved. The casual way in which other characters dismiss Rob's claims to existence reflects a broader pattern where the residents of Elmore have learned to ignore evidence that challenges their understanding of their reality's nature. They cannot afford to acknowledge that some among them exist in states of reduced significance or narrative irrelevance, because such recognition would force them to confront the possibility that their own existence might be equally precarious and arbitrary. This willful blindness to the suffering of those deemed unimportant creates a social dynamic where individuals must constantly compete for narrative attention and relevance, where the fear of being forgotten or dismissed drives behaviors that prioritize spectacle and drama over genuine human connection and mutual support. Characters learn that being boring or unremarkable is tantamount to ceasing to exist, that their survival depends upon maintaining the interest and attention of forces they cannot see or understand. The memory manipulation that occurs throughout Elmore's history represents perhaps the most insidious form of existential assault, as it strikes at the very foundation of personal identity and continuity of experience. Characters regularly experience situations where their memories of past events are altered or erased without their knowledge or consent, creating gaps and inconsistencies in their understanding of their own lives that they cannot explain or address. This systematic interference with memory creates a situation where individuals cannot trust their own perceptions or experiences, where the basic building blocks of identity and self-understanding are subject to external manipulation by entities whose motivations remain completely opaque. The residents of Elmore live in a reality where their most cherished memories might be fabrications, where their understanding of their relationships and personal history might be completely false, where their sense of self is built upon foundations that could be altered or removed at any moment. The psychological impact of this uncertainty extends beyond mere confusion or disorientation into territories of genuine madness, as characters struggle to maintain coherent identities when the memories that define them prove to be unreliable. They cannot build upon past experiences because they cannot be certain those experiences actually occurred as they remember them. They cannot learn from mistakes because their understanding of what mistakes they have made is subject to constant revision. The horror deepens when we consider that characters occasionally become aware of these memory alterations, recognizing that their recollections have been changed, but lacking the ability to recover their original memories or prevent future manipulations. They know that their minds have been violated, that their understanding of their own lives has been compromised, yet they remain powerless to protect themselves from further interference or to restore their authentic memories and experiences. False realities layer upon themselves throughout Elmore's existence, creating nested levels of deception where characters must navigate not only the fundamental unreality of their cartoon existence, but also additional layers of illusion and misdirection that further distance them from any authentic understanding of their circumstances. They live in simulations within simulations, dreams within dreams, stories within stories, each layer adding additional complexity and uncertainty to their already precarious relationship with truth and reality. These multiple levels of false reality create situations where characters cannot distinguish between genuine experiences and manufactured illusions, where their attempts to understand their circumstances are constantly thwarted by the discovery that what they believed to be real was merely another layer of deception, designed to conceal even deeper layers of manipulation and control. The quest for authentic understanding becomes a journey through an infinite regression of lies and illusions, each revelation leading not to truth but to additional questions and uncertainties. The residents of Elmore sometimes catch glimpses of the mechanisms that maintain their false realities, brief moments when the illusions slip and they can perceive the artificial nature of their experiences. These revelations are simultaneously liberating and terrifying, as they provide evidence that escape from their circumstances might be possible, while also revealing the enormous scope and sophistication of the forces arrayed against their freedom and autonomy. Yet these moments of clarity are always temporary, as the systems maintaining their false realities quickly reassert themselves, erasing evidence of their artificial nature and restoring the illusions that keep the characters trapped within predetermined patterns of behavior and experience. The brief taste of truth makes their return to ignorance, all the more painful as they retain just enough awareness to recognize that something important has been taken from them without being able to remember what it was or how to recover it. Characters aging inconsistently or not at all represents another manifestation of the fundamental instability that characterizes existence in Elmore, where the basic biological processes that define mortal life are subject to arbitrary manipulation and revision according to narrative convenience rather than natural law. Some characters remain frozen at specific ages regardless of the passage of time, while others age rapidly or inconsistently according to the demands of particular storylines. This temporal inconsistency creates profound confusion about the nature of time itself within their reality, as characters struggle to understand how much time has actually passed, how old they really are, and whether their experiences of temporal progression bear any relationship to objective reality. The absence of consistent aging processes makes it impossible for them to use their physical development as a reliable marker of time's passage or personal growth. The psychological impact of temporal inconsistency extends into every aspect of personal identity and relationships, as characters cannot rely upon shared memories of time's passage to maintain connections with others or build upon past experiences. Their relationships exist in a kind of eternal present, where previous interactions might have occurred days or years ago, according to their subjective experience, but the objective timeline remains completely unclear and potentially meaningless. Children who should be developing and maturing instead remain trapped in states of artificial childhood, denied the natural progression of growth and development that would allow them to build adult identities and capabilities. Adults who should be aging and accumulating wisdom instead remain frozen in patterns that prevent them from learning from experience or adapting to changing circumstances. The entire concept of personal development becomes meaningless when the basic framework of temporal progression is absent or unreliable. The meaninglessness of cartoon existence reveals itself most clearly in moments when characters recognize that their struggles, achievements, and relationships serve no purpose beyond providing entertainment for external observers who remain invisible and incomprehensible to them. Their pain is not meaningful suffering that leads to growth or understanding, but rather spectacle designed to amuse beings whose relationship to their reality is fundamentally exploitative. This recognition transforms every experience, no matter how intense or personally significant, into a performance that must be evaluated not according to its authentic meaning for the characters involved, but according to its effectiveness as entertainment for unseen audiences. Love becomes a dramatic device. Suffering becomes comedic material. Growth becomes a temporary plot element that will be reset when it becomes inconvenient or boring. The residents of Elmore must somehow find ways to maintain their sanity and sense of purpose while living with the awareness that their most profound experiences are valued primarily for their entertainment potential rather than their authentic significance. They must continue to care about relationships and goals that they know are ultimately arbitrary, to invest themselves emotionally in outcomes that they understand are predetermined by forces beyond their influence. Philosophical implications of living in a scripted world extend far beyond the immediate psychological challenges to encompass fundamental questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of consciousness itself. If the residents of Elmore are following predetermined scripts rather than making authentic choices, can they be held responsible for their actions? Do their decisions have any moral significance if the outcomes are predetermined by external forces? The apparent existence of free will within predetermined constraints creates paradoxes that challenge basic assumptions about the nature of choice and responsibility. Characters seem to experience themselves as making real decisions, Yet those decisions consistently lead to outcomes that serve narrative purposes rather than their own authentic interests and desires. They are simultaneously agents and objects, subjects experiencing choice and characters following scripts. This philosophical confusion extends into their relationships with each other, as they must navigate the question of whether their love and loyalty are genuine emotions or simply programmed responses designed to create appealing storylines. When Gumball expresses affection for Darwin, is he experiencing authentic fraternal love? Or is he simply following emotional programming designed to maintain their relationship dynamic for the entertainment of observers? The question becomes even more complex when we consider that the characters themselves cannot distinguish between authentic emotions and programmed responses, that their subjective experience of love, fear, anger, and joy feels completely genuine to them, regardless of its ultimate origin or purpose. They must live with emotions that feel real, while questioning whether those emotions have any meaning beyond their narrative function. The scripted nature of their existence creates situations where characters must somehow maintain hope and purpose, while understanding that their future is predetermined by forces they cannot influence or understand. They know that their struggles will resolve according to predetermined patterns, that their growth will be reset when it becomes inconvenient, that their relationships will be manipulated to serve narrative purposes rather than their own happiness and fulfillment. Yet, they continue to invest themselves in these predetermined outcomes because the alternative, complete nihilistic surrender to meaninglessness, would make their existence unbearable. They choose to find meaning in experiences they know are artificial, to value relationships they understand are manipulated, to pursue goals they recognize are predetermined, because the subjective experience of meaning and purpose is preferable to the objective recognition of their powerlessness. This creates a form of existential courage that transcends ordinary heroism, as the residents of Elmore continue to live, love, and strive, despite their awareness that their efforts are ultimately futile. They maintain their humanity not because they believe their actions matter in any objective sense, but because the act of continuing to care and try represents a form of defiance against the forces that seek to reduce them to mere entertainment. The deepest horror of their situation lies not in any particular aspect of their suffering, but in the totality of their circumstances. The way multiple forms of existential assault combine to create a reality where authentic meaning and purpose become nearly impossible to maintain. They are trapped in bodies that may not be real, living relationships that may be fabricated, pursuing goals that may be predetermined, experiencing emotions that may be programmed, all while being observed by entities whose motivations they cannot understand and whose judgments determine their continued existence. Yet within this nightmare of existential uncertainty, moments of genuine beauty and meaning somehow persist, suggesting that consciousness itself possesses a resilience that transcends the circumstances in which it finds itself. The love between family members, the loyalty between friends, the simple joy of shared experiences. These elements of their existence retain their power to provide comfort and purpose, even when their ultimate reality remains in question. The economic landscape of Elmore reveals itself as a grotesque parody of functional capitalism, where the basic principles that should govern fair exchange and productive enterprise have been corrupted into systems of exploitation and manipulation that serve primarily to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of those least deserving of either. The vast disparities in economic circumstances that characterize this supposedly egalitarian community are not the result of differences in talent, effort, or contribution to society, but rather the predictable outcomes of structural inequalities that have been designed to benefit those who already possess advantages, while systematically disadvantaging those who most need opportunities for advancement and improvement. The Watterson family's perpetual financial struggles serve as perhaps the clearest illustration of how economic systems can fail to reward virtue, effort, or even basic competence, instead creating situations where hardworking individuals like Nicole find themselves trapped in cycles of poverty, despite their obvious intelligence, dedication, and willingness to sacrifice for the benefit of others. Her multiple jobs and exhausting work schedule produce barely enough income to maintain her family's most basic needs, while others in the community enjoy comfortable lifestyles despite contributing far less value to society through their labor or activities. This disparity becomes even more disturbing when we consider that Nicole's economic struggles are directly related to her husband's complete abdication of adult responsibility, creating a situation where one person's dysfunction becomes another person's economic burden, in ways that the broader economic system not only fails to address but actually reinforces through its structural biases and assumptions about family dynamics and individual responsibility. The community's wealthier residents display their advantages not through superior moral character or greater contributions to the common good, but rather through their ability to navigate systems of privilege and exploitation that remain largely invisible to those who benefit from them. Their prosperity is built upon foundations of inherited advantage, social connections, and institutional biases that have nothing to do with merit or deserving. Yet these advantages are treated as evidence of their superior worth and judgment. The normalization of extreme wealth inequality creates a social environment where the suffering of the poor is dismissed as evidence of their personal failings, rather than recognized as symptoms of systematic dysfunction that could be addressed through collective action and structural reform. The wealthy residents of Elmore demonstrate no awareness that their comfort depends upon the exploitation of others, no recognition that their advantages come at the direct expense of families like the Wattersons, who struggle to maintain basic dignity while working far harder than those who judge them for their poverty. Corporate manipulation reaches into every aspect of daily life in Elmore, transforming what should be spaces for community building and mutual support into hunting grounds, where sophisticated marketing techniques prey upon the psychological vulnerabilities of residents who lack the resources or education necessary to protect themselves from systematic exploitation. The shopping mall that serves as a central gathering place for the community has been designed not to serve the needs of its visitors, but rather to manipulate their desires and extract maximum profit through techniques that blur the line between commerce and psychological warfare. The stores and restaurants that populate these commercial spaces employ marketing strategies that target the deepest insecurities and unmet needs of their customers, promising fulfillment and happiness through consumption, while delivering products and services that create additional dissatisfaction and dependency. Children are particularly vulnerable to these manipulative techniques, as they lack the cognitive development necessary to recognize and resist sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as entertainment and social connection. The credit and financing systems that supposedly make expensive purchases accessible to working families instead create debt traps that transform temporary financial difficulties into permanent states of economic servitude, where individuals find themselves paying far more than the original cost of their purchases while never achieving actual ownership or satisfaction. These systems are deliberately designed to create dependency and extract maximum profit from people who can least afford such exploitation. The advertising and promotional techniques employed throughout Elmore's commercial landscape demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that is used not to help people make informed decisions about their purchases, but rather to bypass rational decision-making processes and trigger impulsive behaviors that serve corporate interests rather than consumer well-being. The constant bombardment of marketing messages creates an environment where residents are perpetually dissatisfied with their current circumstances and constantly seeking external solutions to internal problems. The employment practices that govern Elmore's economy reveal how power imbalances between employers and workers are systematically exploited to extract maximum labor value while providing minimal compensation and support to those whose efforts actually create the wealth that flows upward to business owners and investors. Workers like Nicole find themselves subject to arbitrary schedules, unrealistic performance expectations, and constant threats of termination, all designed to keep them desperate and compliant rather than empowered to advocate for fair treatment. The absence of meaningful worker protections or collective bargaining rights leaves individual employees vulnerable to exploitation and abuse that would be clearly recognized as unacceptable if it occurred in other social contexts. The power dynamic between employers and employees has been structured to ensure that those who create value through their labor have no effective voice in determining how that value is distributed or how their working conditions are maintained. The gig economy that characterizes much of Elmore's employment landscape promises flexibility and independence, while actually delivering instability and insecurity that makes long-term planning impossible for working families. The shift away from traditional employment relationships toward contract and temporary work arrangements transfers economic risk from businesses to workers, while eliminating most of the protections and benefits that previous generations of workers fought to establish. This economic precarity creates social conditions where families cannot invest in their children's education and development, cannot plan for retirement or major life changes, cannot build the kind of intergenerational wealth that provides stability and opportunity across generations. The short-term thinking that results from economic insecurity perpetuates cycles of poverty and dysfunction that affect not only current families, but also their children and grandchildren. Consumerism has evolved beyond mere economic activity into a form of social control that shapes identity, relationships, and values in ways that serve corporate interests rather than human flourishing or community well-being. The residents of Elmore have been conditioned to derive their sense of self-worth and social status from their consumption patterns rather than from their contributions to their community, their personal growth and development, or their relationships with others. This transformation of consumption into identity creates situations where people purchase products not because they need or even want them in any authentic sense, but because they have been convinced that their social acceptance and personal worth depend upon displaying the correct brands and lifestyle markers. The psychological manipulation required to maintain these consumption patterns demonstrates how thoroughly individual autonomy and authentic choice have been compromised by systems designed to extract profit rather than serve genuine human needs. The environmental consequences of this consumption-driven culture are treated as externalities that do not factor into economic decision-making processes, despite their obvious impact on the community's long-term sustainability and livability. The constant production and disposal of goods designed for planned obsolescence creates waste streams and pollution that degrade the natural environment upon which all economic activity ultimately depends. The social pressure to maintain certain consumption patterns creates additional financial stress for families who are already struggling with basic expenses, as they feel compelled to purchase items and services that serve social signaling functions rather than meeting authentic needs. This pressure is particularly intense for children and teenagers, who face social exclusion if they cannot afford the brands and products that have been established as markers of acceptable social status. Social media platforms that present themselves as neutral tools for communication and connection have instead become sophisticated systems for harvesting personal information and manipulating behavior in ways that serve the interests of advertisers and data brokers rather than the users whose information is being collected and sold. The residents of Elmore engage with these platforms believing they are connecting with friends and family, unaware that their interactions are being monitored, analyzed, and used to create psychological profiles that enable increasingly precise forms of manipulation and control. The addictive design features built into these platforms are deliberately engineered to maximize user engagement and data collection, rather than to promote healthy social connections or meaningful communication. The constant stream of notifications, likes, comments, and shares creates psychological dependency patterns that interfere with users' ability to focus on other activities or maintain relationships that exist outside the digital realm. The information ecosystems created by social media algorithms tend to reinforce existing beliefs and biases, rather than exposing users to diverse perspectives or accurate information about important issues. This creates intellectual echo chambers, where misinformation can spread rapidly while factual information that challenges popular narratives is suppressed or ignored, leading to social polarization and decision-making based on false or incomplete information. The privacy violations that enable targeted advertising and behavioral manipulation are presented as necessary trade-offs for free services, despite the fact that users are actually paying for these services through their personal information and their exposure to manipulative content designed to influence their behavior in ways that benefit corporate interests rather than their own well-being. Environmental destruction in Elmore proceeds with the casual indifference that characterizes a society where short-term profits are consistently prioritized over long-term sustainability, where the costs of environmental degradation are externalized to future generations, while the benefits of destructive practices are captured by current business interests. The natural systems that provide the foundation for all economic and social activity are treated as free resources to be exploited rather than precious assets, requiring careful stewardship and protection. The air and water pollution that results from industrial and commercial activities creates health problems that disproportionately affect the community's most vulnerable residents, particularly children and elderly individuals whose immune systems are less capable of processing environmental toxins. These health impacts create additional economic burdens for families who must pay for medical treatment, while also dealing with reduced productivity and quality of life. The waste disposal practices employed throughout the community demonstrate a complete lack of concern for environmental consequences, with toxic materials routinely dumped in ways that contaminate soil and groundwater, while creating long-term hazards for anyone who comes into contact with affected areas. The regulatory systems that should prevent such environmental crimes are either absent, ineffective, or corrupted by the same business interests that profit from environmentally destructive practices. The depletion of natural resources proceeds without any meaningful planning for sustainability or renewable alternatives, creating conditions where future generations will inherit an environment that has been stripped of the resources necessary to maintain current living standards. The short-term thinking that drives these practices reflects the broader cultural inability to consider long-term consequences or intergenerational responsibility. Government corruption in Elmore operates through systems that have transformed public service from a noble calling dedicated to the common good into opportunities for personal enrichment and the advancement of private interests at public expense. Elected officials and appointed administrators routinely make decisions based on their potential for personal gain rather than their impact on the community's well-being, creating policies that serve narrow special interests rather than the broader public good. The electoral processes that should ensure democratic accountability have been compromised by the influence of corporate money and special interest lobbying that makes it nearly impossible for candidates who represent ordinary citizens' interests to compete effectively against those who serve wealthy donors and powerful business interests. The result is a political system where public policy is essentially purchased by the highest bidders rather than determined through genuine democratic deliberation and choice. The regulatory agencies that should protect citizens from corporate abuse and environmental destruction have been captured by the very industries they are supposed to oversee, creating situations where regulatory decisions consistently favor business interests over public safety and environmental protection. The revolving door between regulatory positions and corporate employment ensures that those making regulatory decisions have strong incentives to maintain favorable relationships with the industries they are regulating. The public services that should provide essential support for community well-being are chronically underfunded and poorly managed, reflecting political priorities that favor tax cuts for wealthy individuals and corporations over investments in education, infrastructure, healthcare, and other services that would benefit ordinary citizens. This systematic underinvestment in public services creates conditions where private providers can charge premium prices for services that should be available as public goods. The breakdown of community and human connection that characterizes modern life in Elmore reflects the systematic destruction of social institutions and cultural practices that once provided meaning, support, and shared identity for community members. The traditional networks of mutual aid and social support that helped families and individuals navigate difficult circumstances have been replaced by market-based relationships where every interaction is mediated by financial considerations rather than genuine concern for others' well-being. The social isolation that results from this breakdown of community solidarity creates conditions where individuals and families must face life's challenges without the support systems that previous generations could take for granted. This isolation is particularly damaging for children and elderly residents, who depend most heavily on community support and are least able to advocate for their own needs in market-based systems. The cultural institutions that should preserve and transmit community values and traditions have been commercialized or eliminated, replaced by entertainment and media products that serve corporate interests rather than community cohesion. The shared stories, rituals, and celebrations that once bound community members together across generational and cultural differences have given way to individualized consumption experiences that isolate people rather than bringing them together. The civic organizations and voluntary associations that once provided opportunities for community members to work together on shared projects and develop leadership skills have been weakened by the time pressures and economic insecurity that force people to focus on immediate survival needs rather than broader community engagement. The result is a community where collective action becomes increasingly difficult to organize and sustain, leaving residents vulnerable to exploitation by powerful interests that face no organized opposition. The systematic failure to recognize and address the profound psychological suffering that permeates every aspect of life in Elmore represents perhaps the most damning indictment of a society that has abandoned its most vulnerable members to navigate complex mental health challenges without adequate support, understanding, or professional intervention. The residents of this community display clear symptoms of serious psychological disorders that would require immediate attention and long-term treatment in any functional healthcare system. Yet their obvious distress is consistently dismissed as personality quirks, character flaws, or amusing behavioral patterns, rather than recognized as manifestations of untreated mental illness that creates cascading harm throughout their social networks. The normalization of psychological dysfunction creates an environment where individuals suffering from severe mental health conditions learn to view their symptoms as immutable aspects of their identity rather than treatable conditions that could be addressed through appropriate therapeutic intervention and medical support. This internalization of illness as identity prevents them from seeking help even when such help might be available, as they have been conditioned to believe that their suffering is simply an unavoidable part of who they are, rather than a medical condition that responds to treatment. Richard Watterson's apparent developmental disabilities and possible cognitive impairments manifest in ways that would immediately trigger comprehensive psychological evaluation and support services in any community with functional mental health infrastructure. Yet his obvious struggles with executive function, emotional regulation, and basic life skills are treated as sources of amusement rather than symptoms requiring professional attention and family support. His inability to maintain employment, manage financial responsibilities, or engage in age-appropriate social interactions reflects underlying neurological or psychological conditions that create genuine suffering for both himself and his family members. The psychological impact of living with untreated cognitive disabilities extends far beyond the immediate functional limitations to encompass profound feelings of inadequacy, confusion, and social isolation that compound the original problems, while creating additional barriers to seeking and receiving appropriate help. Richard's childlike behavior patterns may represent adaptive mechanisms developed to cope with cognitive challenges that he cannot understand or articulate, yet these same patterns create additional stress and dysfunction within his family system. His family members' responses to his condition reveal how caregiver, burnout, and chronic stress can transform loving relationships into sources of resentment and emotional exhaustion, particularly when adequate support services are unavailable, and the full burden of managing his care falls upon individuals who lack the training, resources, or emotional capacity to provide appropriate assistance while maintaining their own psychological well-being. Nicole's explosive rage episodes and violent outbursts represent clear symptoms of severe anxiety disorders, chronic stress responses, and possibly underlying mood disorders that have been exacerbated by years of inadequate support and overwhelming responsibility. Her anger is not a character flaw or moral failing, but rather a symptom of psychological trauma that has been accumulating without treatment or recognition, creating patterns of emotional dysregulation that affect every aspect of her family's functioning and well-being. The triggers for Nicole's violent episodes often involve relatively minor stresses that become overwhelming due to her existing state of chronic psychological arousal and emotional exhaustion. Her extreme reactions to everyday problems reflect a nervous system that has been pushed beyond its capacity to cope with stress through healthy mechanisms, resulting in fight or flight responses that are disproportionate to immediate threats, but entirely understandable given her overall psychological state. The physical manifestations of her anger, which often involve superhuman strength and destructive capabilities that defy normal biological limitations, suggest that her psychological distress has reached levels that transcend ordinary human experience. Yet this obvious indication of severe mental health crisis never prompts professional intervention or community support. Instead, her family members learn to accommodate her explosive episodes as normal aspects of their domestic life, developing their own maladaptive coping strategies that perpetuate the cycle of dysfunction. The impact of witnessing repeated episodes of explosive violence on her children cannot be overstated, as exposure to such intense displays of uncontrolled anger creates lasting trauma that shapes their understanding of relationships, conflict resolution, and emotional expression in ways that will likely affect their adult functioning and their ability to form healthy connections with others. Gumball's manipulative behaviors, narcissistic tendencies, and apparent lack of empathy for others represent possible symptoms of personality disorders or attachment disruptions that have developed in response to his chaotic family environment and the absence of consistent, nurturing caregiving relationships. His patterns of exploitation and emotional manipulation may represent learned survival strategies rather than inherent character flaws. Yet these same patterns create additional dysfunction within his social relationships and prevent him from developing the capacity for genuine intimacy and mutual support. The psychological mechanisms underlying Gumball's behavior suggest possible trauma responses that have been adapted to serve protective functions within his dysfunctional family system. Yet these same adaptations become maladaptive when applied to relationships with peers, teachers, and other community members who expect reciprocity, honesty, and emotional consideration in their interactions. His apparent inability to recognize or respond appropriately to others' emotional needs and boundaries may reflect developmental trauma that has impaired his capacity for empathy and emotional regulation, creating patterns of interaction that consistently harm others, while preventing him from experiencing the genuine connection and support that he desperately needs for healthy psychological development. The grandiose self-image and entitled attitudes that characterize much of Gumball's behavior may serve defensive functions that protect him from acknowledging his own vulnerability and emotional needs. Yet these same defense mechanisms prevent him from forming the authentic relationships that could provide healing and support for his underlying psychological wounds. Darwin's extreme loyalty and self-sacrificing behaviors represent possible symptoms of codependency, trauma bonding, and learned helplessness that have developed as adaptations to his position within an abusive family system where his survival and acceptance depend upon meeting others' needs while suppressing his own legitimate desires and boundaries. His willingness to endure mistreatment and exploitation may reflect attachment disorders that have convinced him that love and abuse are inevitably connected. The psychological conditioning that maintains Darwin's submissive role within his family involves complex reinforcement patterns, where his self-sacrifice is periodically rewarded with affection and inclusion, creating intermittent reinforcement schedules that are among the most powerful methods for maintaining behavioral patterns, even when those patterns are ultimately harmful to the individual involved. His apparent inability to recognize or respond to his own needs and preferences may reflect dissociation from his internal emotional experience, a common trauma response that allows individuals to function within abusive environments by disconnecting from awareness of their own pain and suffering. This disconnection, while protective in the short term, prevents him from developing the self-advocacy skills and emotional awareness necessary for healthy adult relationships. The chronic hypervigilance and anxiety that characterize Darwin's interactions with others reflect his unconscious awareness that his acceptance within relationships is conditional upon his willingness to sacrifice his own well-being for others' benefit, creating a state of constant emotional stress that depletes his psychological resources while preventing him from experiencing genuine security and unconditional acceptance. Aeneas's premature emotional maturity and excessive responsibility-taking represent possible symptoms of parentification, trauma, where children are forced to assume adult roles and responsibilities that exceed their developmental capacity, creating psychological burdens that interfere with normal childhood development and create lasting difficulties with identity formation and boundary setting in adult relationships. The intellectual precocity that characterizes Anais' approach to family problems may represent a hypervigilant cognitive style developed in response to environmental unpredictability, where constant analysis and problem-solving become necessary survival strategies rather than natural expressions of intellectual curiosity and academic interest. This cognitive hyperactivity, while adaptive within her chaotic family environment, may prevent her from experiencing the relaxation and playfulness necessary for healthy emotional development. Her role as the family's unofficial therapist and crisis manager places psychological burdens upon her that would challenge trained adult professionals, yet she receives no support or recognition for the emotional labor she performs, while simultaneously being expected to maintain her own academic performance and social development. This impossible combination of responsibilities creates chronic stress that manifests in perfectionism, anxiety, and difficulties forming peer relationships with children who have not experienced similar levels of family dysfunction. The isolation that results from her advanced intellectual development combined with her premature emotional responsibilities creates a particularly painful form of loneliness, as she cannot relate to peers who seem childish and carefree, while also lacking access to adults who might understand and support her unusual circumstances and psychological burdens. The traumatic events that occur regularly within Elmore's supposedly comedic environment are normalized through repetition and social acceptance, rather than recognized as experiences that create lasting psychological damage, requiring therapeutic intervention and community support. Children and adults alike are exposed to violence, abandonment, emotional abuse, and life-threatening situations with such frequency that they develop psychological numbing and dissociative responses that allow them to function despite ongoing trauma exposure. This normalization of trauma creates communities where individuals lose the ability to recognize when experiences cross the line from normal stress into actual psychological injury, preventing them from seeking appropriate help, while also reducing their capacity to provide support and protection for others who are experiencing similar harm. The collective trauma that results from widespread exposure to violence and dysfunction becomes a shared cultural experience that shapes community norms and expectations in ways that perpetuate cycles of abuse and neglect. The humor and entertainment value that observers derive from these traumatic experiences creates additional psychological injury by teaching victims that their pain is amusing to others rather than deserving of compassion and support. This commodification of trauma transforms suffering into spectacle while preventing the development of empathetic responses that might lead to protective interventions or healing relationships. The long-term developmental impact of growing up in environments where trauma is normalized includes impaired capacity for trust, difficulties with emotional regulation, disrupted attachment patterns, and increased vulnerability to re-victimization throughout life. These effects compound across generations as traumatized individuals struggle to provide stable, nurturing environments for their own children while lacking access to the therapeutic resources necessary to break cycles of intergenerational trauma. Addiction, obsession, and compulsive behaviors manifest throughout Elmore's population in ways that clearly indicate underlying psychological disorders and self-medication attempts. Yet these symptoms are treated as personality quirks or lifestyle choices, rather than recognized as manifestations of mental illness, requiring professional treatment and ongoing support. The normalization of addictive behaviors prevents individuals from recognizing when their coping mechanisms have become self-destructive patterns that require intervention. The social environment that enables and reinforces addictive behaviors creates situations where individuals cannot access the social support and accountability that might help them recognize and address their problems before they become entrenched patterns that resist change. Instead, community norms normalize excessive consumption, compulsive behaviors, and emotional avoidance in ways that make it difficult for individuals to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy coping strategies. The underlying psychological pain that drives addictive and compulsive behaviors remains unaddressed while individuals focus on managing symptoms rather than treating root causes, creating cycles of temporary relief followed by increased distress that gradually worsen over time. Without access to therapeutic interventions that address underlying trauma, depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions, individuals remain trapped in behavioral patterns that provide short-term relief while creating long-term problems. The impact of untreated addiction and compulsive behaviors extends throughout family systems and social networks, creating additional trauma and dysfunction that affects children, partners, and community members who lack the resources and understanding necessary to provide appropriate support while protecting their own psychological well-being. Emotional abuse, disguised as normal family dynamics, creates psychological environments where harmful behaviors are rationalized as expressions of love, concern, or appropriate discipline, rather than recognized as patterns of manipulation and control that cause lasting psychological damage. The normalization of emotional abuse within family systems teaches children that love and mistreatment are connected, creating expectations for adult relationships that perpetuate cycles of abuse across generations. The subtle nature of emotional abuse makes it particularly difficult for victims to recognize and respond to, as the behaviors involved are often presented as normal expressions of family closeness or concern, rather than recognized as violations of psychological boundaries that cause genuine harm. This confusion between love and abuse prevents victims from developing healthy relationship expectations, while also making it difficult for others to recognize when intervention might be necessary. The gaslighting and reality distortion that often accompany emotional abuse create situations where victims learn to doubt their own perceptions and emotional responses, developing chronic self-doubt and anxiety that interfere with their ability to make healthy decisions or advocate for their own needs in relationships. This psychological conditioning makes victims vulnerable to further abuse while preventing them from accessing the support and validation necessary for healing. The intergenerational transmission of emotional abuse occurs through modeling and learned behavioral patterns that children absorb as normal ways of expressing emotion and managing relationships, creating cycles where abusive behaviors are passed down through generations despite victims' conscious intentions to break these patterns through their own parenting and relationship choices. The complete absence of mental health resources and professional support services in Elmore creates conditions where individuals suffering from serious psychological disorders must navigate their symptoms without appropriate treatment, professional guidance, or community support systems that could provide assistance during crisis periods or ongoing management of chronic conditions. This systematic neglect of mental health needs creates preventable suffering while also contributing to broader social dysfunction and community instability. The stigmatization of mental health problems prevents individuals from seeking help even when such help might be available, as community attitudes treat psychological symptoms as evidence of personal weakness or moral failing, rather than as medical conditions deserving of compassionate treatment and support. This social stigma compounds the isolation and shame that often accompany mental illness, while creating barriers to recovery that serve no constructive purpose. The lack of early intervention and prevention programs means that psychological problems that could be addressed effectively in their early stages instead develop into chronic conditions that require more intensive treatment, while creating more extensive damage to individuals' functioning and relationships. The failure to invest in mental health infrastructure creates long-term costs that far exceed the resources that would be required to provide appropriate preventive care and early treatment. The training and education deficits that prevent community members from recognizing signs of mental illness or providing appropriate first aid and support during psychological crises contribute to situations where individuals experiencing mental health emergencies do not receive timely assistance, while also lacking access to informal support networks that could provide ongoing encouragement and practical assistance during difficult periods. Certain episodes of Gumball transcend the boundaries of conventional children's entertainment to venture into territories of psychological horror that would be immediately recognizable as deeply disturbing if they were not disguised by colorful animation and the presumption of comedic intent. These particular installments serve as windows into the darkest implications of the world that the Watterson family inhabits, revealing the underlying mechanisms of control, manipulation, and existential terror that normally remain hidden beneath layers of surface-level absurdity and apparent innocence. The episode entitled "The Puppets" presents what may be the most overtly horrifying exploration of free will and autonomous choice ever produced for a children's audience. Disguised as a seemingly innocent story about Gumball and Darwin's discomfort with Anais' unusual friends, the puppet characters that Anais brings home initially appear to be nothing more than inanimate objects that she uses for imaginative play. Yet, as the episode progresses, the line between animate and inanimate, between controlled and controlling, becomes increasingly blurred in ways that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and voluntary action. The puppet's gradual assumption of apparent independence represents a manifestation of every parent's deepest fear about the influences that shape their children's development. Yet, the horror extends far beyond concerns about peer pressure or inappropriate media consumption into questions about whether any of the characters possess genuine autonomy, or whether they are all merely puppets being manipulated by forces they cannot perceive or understand. Gumball and Darwin's growing unease with the puppets reflects their unconscious recognition that these inanimate objects somehow possess agency and intention that rival or exceed their own, creating a situation where the boundary between subject and object, between actor and acted upon, becomes meaningless. Their attempts to assert control over the situation only reveal the extent to which their own actions may be similarly controlled by external forces that remain invisible to them. The episode's resolution, which involves the puppets apparently choosing to leave rather than being forcibly removed, suggests that the power dynamic was never what it appeared to be, that the supposed victims of manipulation were actually willing participants in their own control. This revelation transforms the entire episode from a story about external threat into a meditation on the possibility that all apparent choice and autonomy may be illusory, that consciousness itself may be nothing more than an elaborate puppet show performed for audiences that remain forever invisible to the performers. The psychological implications of this narrative extend into every aspect of the character's existence, as viewers are forced to question whether Gumball, Darwin, and Anais are any more real or autonomous than the puppets they fear, whether their own choices and actions are genuine expressions of free will, or simply more sophisticated forms of the same puppet-like behavior they find so disturbing in inanimate objects. The Joy presents an even more disturbing exploration of forced happiness and social control, examining what happens when emotional states become mandatory rather than voluntary, when the appearance of contentment is enforced through mechanisms that eliminate the possibility of authentic feeling or genuine choice. The episode begins with what appears to be a simple story about an infectious form of happiness that spreads throughout the school, yet quickly reveals itself to be a nightmare scenario where individual autonomy is sacrificed in service of collective emotional uniformity. The infectious joy that spreads from student to student operates through mechanisms that bypass rational thought and conscious choice, transforming complex individuals with their own unique emotional landscapes into identical expressions of artificial contentment that serves the interests of social control rather than personal fulfillment. The affected individuals lose not only their capacity for negative emotions, but also their ability to recognize that this loss represents a form of psychological amputation that diminishes their humanity. The episode's exploration of how this enforced happiness is received by authority figures reveals the extent to which social institutions prefer compliant, uniform emotional states over the messy complexity of authentic human feeling, even when such compliance comes at the cost of individual identity and psychological wholeness. Teachers and administrators celebrate the infected students' artificial contentment without recognizing or caring that this happiness represents a fundamental violation of their personhood. Gumball and Darwin's resistance to the infectious joy positions them as the last defenders of emotional authenticity in an environment where such authenticity has been redefined as a form of social deviance requiring correction. Their struggle to maintain their complex emotional lives in the face of pressure to conform to artificial happiness becomes a metaphor for broader struggles against systems that prioritize social control over individual freedom, authentic expression. The mechanisms through which the joy spreads suggest that even positive emotions can become tools of oppression when they are imposed rather than chosen, when they serve institutional interests rather than personal growth and authentic self-expression. The episode reveals how easily populations can be manipulated through promises of happiness and contentment, particularly when the alternative appears to be continued suffering and struggle. The ultimate horror of the joy lies not in any particular scary image or violent event, but in its suggestion that happiness itself can become a form of psychological prison when it eliminates the full range of human emotional experience that gives life meaning and depth. The episode forces viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about whether genuine happiness is possible in environments where other emotions are forbidden or suppressed. The Choices ventures into alternate timeline horror by exploring the cascading consequences that flow from seemingly insignificant decisions, revealing how different versions of familiar characters can emerge from slightly different life circumstances in ways that call into question the stability of identity and the inevitability of personality development. The episode presents multiple versions of the Watterson family that exist in parallel realities, each shaped by different choices and experiences that have led to dramatically different outcomes. The alternate versions of familiar characters serve as disturbing reminders that identity is far more fragile and contingent than most people prefer to believe, that the personalities and relationships that define their world could easily have developed along completely different trajectories if circumstances had been only slightly different. The recognition that their current selves are just one possibility among many creates existential anxiety about the arbitrariness of their existence and the contingency of everything they value about their lives. The exploration of how small decisions create large consequences becomes particularly disturbing when applied to the relationship dynamics within the Watterson family, as viewers witness versions of the family where love has turned to hatred, where protective instincts have become destructive, where the bonds that hold them together have been replaced by forces that drive them apart. The episode's suggestion that multiple versions of reality exist simultaneously raises questions about which version should be considered authentic or real, whether the characters viewers have come to know represent the true versions of these individuals, or merely one arbitrary possibility among infinite alternatives. This multiplicity of selves undermines any stable sense of identity or relationship continuity, The process by which characters become aware of their alternate selves creates psychological trauma that extends beyond mere curiosity about different life paths into genuine horror at the recognition that their entire understanding of themselves and their relationships may be based on nothing more than cosmic accident, rather than inevitable destiny or authentic choice. The future explores predestination anxiety through Banana Joe's apparent ability to predict future events, creating a narrative environment where the illusion of free will and open possibility is gradually eroded by the recognition that outcomes may be predetermined, regardless of the character's choices or efforts. The episode begins as a light-hearted exploration of fortune-telling, but evolves into a meditation on fate, determinism, and the psychological impact of believing that one's future is already fixed. The accuracy of Banana Joe's predictions creates a growing sense of dread as characters realize that their actions and decisions may be meaningless if outcomes are already determined by forces beyond their control or understanding. The psychological weight of predestination becomes particularly heavy when the predicted futures involve suffering, loss, or failure that the characters feel powerless to prevent, despite their advanced knowledge. The episode explores how knowledge of future events can become a form of psychological torture, as characters must continue living their lives while knowing that their efforts to change their circumstances are futile. This knowledge transforms every moment of apparent choice into an exercise in cosmic puppetry, where characters go through the motions of decision-making while understanding that their paths are already fixed. The social dynamics that emerge around Banana Joe's predictions reveal how communities respond to the apparent presence of predestination, with some individuals becoming paralyzed by the knowledge of their fixed futures, while others attempt to use this knowledge to their advantage, creating conflicts that arise directly from their attempts to navigate a reality where free will may be illusory. The episode's exploration of temporal mechanics raises questions about the relationship between knowledge and fate, whether knowing the future creates that future or simply reveals what was always going to happen, whether the character's awareness of their predicted destinies becomes part of the mechanism through which those destinies are fulfilled. The Others presents perhaps the most disturbing exploration of identity, replacement, and the arbitrary nature of character existence, examining what happens when familiar individuals are suddenly replaced by alternate versions of themselves who share their memories and relationships but possess fundamentally different personalities and motivations. The episode creates horror through the recognition that identity itself may be far more malleable and replaceable than anyone wants to believe. The replacement of familiar characters with alternate versions creates profound uncertainty about the nature of personal identity and the continuity of relationships, as family members and friends must navigate interactions with individuals who look and sound familiar, but whose fundamental nature has been altered in ways that make meaningful connection impossible or dangerous. The episode explores how communities respond to identity replacement, revealing the extent to which social recognition and acceptance depend upon consistency of behavior and personality rather than physical appearance or shared history. The alternate versions of familiar characters are rejected not because they are obviously imposters, but because their altered personalities make them incompatible with existing relationship dynamics. The mechanism through which identity replacement occurs remains mysterious throughout the episode, creating additional anxiety about the vulnerability of personal identity and the possibility that any individual could be replaced without warning or explanation. This uncertainty transforms every social interaction into a potential encounter with an imposter or alternate version. The psychological impact of witnessing identity replacement extends beyond immediate fear into existential questions about the nature of selfhood and the reliability of memory and perception. Characters must confront the possibility that their understanding of others, and perhaps themselves, may be based on illusions that could be shattered at any moment. The Vegging explores the horror of mindless consumption and voluntary surrender of consciousness, presenting a scenario where characters willingly abandon their capacity for thought and meaningful action in favor of passive entertainment that gradually erodes their humanity while providing immediate gratification. The episode begins as a seemingly innocent story about vacation relaxation, but evolves into a nightmare vision of what happens when individuals choose comfort over growth and passive consumption over active engagement with life. The process by which characters surrender their higher cognitive functions in favor of mindless entertainment consumption serves as a metaphor for broader social trends toward intellectual passivity and the replacement of genuine experience with mediated substitutes that provide immediate satisfaction while undermining long-term well-being and development. The gradual loss of cognitive function that results from extended periods of passive consumption creates situations where individuals become incapable of recognizing their own degradation, as the very faculties necessary for self-reflection and critical thinking are among the first casualties of their voluntary mental abdication. The episode explores how entertainment systems are designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and create dependency patterns that make it increasingly difficult for individuals to choose more challenging, but ultimately more rewarding forms of engagement with their environment and relationships. The social dynamics that emerge around mass consumption of mindless entertainment reveal how communities can collectively abandon their capacity for critical thinking and meaningful action, creating environments where intellectual engagement and emotional depth are viewed as unnecessary burdens rather than essential aspects of human flourishing. The horror of the vegging lies not in any external threat or imposed control, but in the recognition that individuals can choose to surrender their humanity voluntarily, that the greatest threats to consciousness and authentic living may come from within rather than from external forces of oppression or manipulation. The cumulative impact of these darker episodes creates a pattern that reveals the underlying horror that permeates Elmore's seemingly innocent world, where threats to human dignity and authentic existence emerge not primarily from external villains or supernatural forces, but from the systematic erosion of autonomy, consciousness, and genuine human connection through mechanisms that often appear benign or even beneficial on the surface. The sophistication of these psychological horror elements suggests that the creators of these narratives understand the deepest fears and anxieties that characterize contemporary human experience, particularly concerns about the authenticity of consciousness, the reliability of identity, and the possibility of meaningful choice in environments where powerful forces seek to influence and control human behavior for their own purposes. The presentation of these horror elements within the context of children's entertainment creates additional layers of disturbing implication, as it suggests that the psychological threats explored in these episodes may be considered normal or acceptable aspects of childhood development, rather than recognized as genuine dangers requiring protective intervention and conscious resistance. The fundamental instability that characterizes the universe containing Elmore extends far beyond the localized dysfunction of individual families or institutions into cosmic-level threats that call into question the very possibility of continued existence for any conscious beings within this reality. The fabric of space and time itself appears to operate according to principles that prioritize narrative convenience over physical consistency, creating conditions where the basic laws that should govern matter and energy are subject to constant revision based on factors that remain completely incomprehensible to those whose lives depend upon some degree of predictable causation and logical coherence. The universe's tendency toward collapse and reconstruction suggests that what the residents of Elmore experience as stable reality is actually a precarious construction that exists only through the continued operation of maintenance. Systems whose reliability cannot be guaranteed and whose operators remain invisible to those whose existence depends upon their continued function. The casual way in which fundamental aspects of reality can be altered or eliminated indicates that the cosmic infrastructure supporting their world is far more fragile than any of its inhabitants could survive, knowing in complete detail. These universal instabilities manifest in ways that range from the subtle to the catastrophic, creating an environment where residents must adapt to living with constant uncertainty about whether the basic principles governing their existence will remain consistent from one day to the next. The psychological stress of inhabiting a reality where the laws of physics are subject to revision without notice creates forms of existential anxiety that exceed anything that could be addressed through conventional therapeutic intervention or community support systems. The most disturbing aspect of this cosmic instability is not its potential for creating immediate catastrophes, but rather its implications for the meaningfulness of any actions or relationships that the residents of Elmore might develop during periods of apparent stability. If the fundamental nature of reality is subject to arbitrary change, then all forms of human connection, achievement, and understanding become temporary arrangements that could be dissolved or transformed beyond recognition at any moment and for any reason. The maintenance of apparent stability within this fundamentally unstable cosmic environment requires enormous expenditures of energy and attention from forces that exist beyond the perceptual range of ordinary residents, creating a situation where their survival depends upon the continued goodwill and competence of entities whose motivations and limitations they cannot begin to understand or influence through any actions available to them. Rob's transformation from a forgotten background character into a cosmic-level threat represents the most dramatic illustration of how individual psychological trauma can escalate into universal-scale dangers when it occurs. Within a reality where the boundaries between personal and cosmic significance are far more permeable than they appear in more stable forms of existence, his journey from invisibility to omnipotence reveals the terrifying potential that exists within any sufficiently desperate consciousness when it gains access to the underlying control mechanisms that maintain the illusion of natural law and social order. The speed and completeness of Rob's transformation from victim to aggressor demonstrates how quickly marginalized individuals can become existential threats to everyone around them when they discover that their reality operates according to principles that can be manipulated by anyone with sufficient knowledge and motivation. His evolution from seeking recognition and belonging to pursuing universal destruction reflects the psychological progression that can occur when someone realizes that their suffering has been invisible to others, not because of natural limitations, but because of systematic exclusion and deliberate indifference. The cosmic level powers that Rob eventually develops represent not supernatural abilities granted by external forces, but rather the natural result of understanding how their reality actually functions beneath its surface appearance of natural law and social convention. His ability to manipulate fundamental aspects of existence reveals that such manipulation was always possible for anyone who discovered the appropriate techniques and possessed sufficient motivation to use them regardless of consequences. For others, the threat that Rob poses to the continued existence of his universe stems not from his possession of extraordinary weapons or magical abilities, but from his complete loss of investment in the continuation of a reality that has treated him as disposable and forgettable. His transformation into a cosmic destroyer represents the logical endpoint of social exclusion and psychological abandonment when they occur within a system where individual consciousness possesses the potential for unlimited destructive power. The community's complete inability to address or even recognize the legitimate grievances that drove Rob's transformation reveals how thoroughly they have internalized systems of exclusion and marginalization that create the very threats they fear most. Their focus on stopping his destructive actions, rather than addressing the conditions that created his destructive motivations, ensures that similar threats will continue to emerge from other marginalized and forgotten individuals. Time travel paradoxes that plague Elmore's temporal structure create additional layers of cosmic instability where past, present, and future become interchangeable categories that can be manipulated by anyone with access to the appropriate technology or sufficient disregard for the logical consistency that makes meaningful existence possible. The casual way in which characters can alter their own histories or those of others reveals that the temporal framework supporting their reality is far more malleable than it appears, creating situations where cause and effect relationships become meaningless and personal identity loses all connection to continuity of experience. The psychological impact of living in a reality where temporal relationships are unreliable extends beyond mere confusion about chronology into fundamental questions about responsibility, growth, and the possibility of learning from experience when the experiences themselves are subject to constant revision and alteration. Characters cannot build upon past lessons because their past can be changed without their knowledge or consent, cannot plan for future goals, because their future may be determined by forces operating in different temporal frameworks than their present consciousness. The time travel technologies that make these paradoxes possible appear to be accessible to ordinary residents rather than restricted to trained professionals or cosmic entities, creating situations where temporal manipulation becomes another tool for interpersonal conflict rather than remaining safely contained within the realm of theoretical physics or science fiction speculation. The democratization of time travel capabilities ensures that temporal stability becomes dependent upon the good judgment and emotional stability of individuals who have already demonstrated their unfitness for managing far simpler responsibilities. The cascading effects that result from temporal manipulations create butterfly effect scenarios, where small changes in the past produce enormous and unpredictable alterations in present circumstances. Yet these consequences often remain invisible to the individuals responsible for creating them, ensuring that they will continue to manipulate temporal relationships without understanding the full scope of damage they are causing to the cosmic infrastructure supporting their existence. The resolution of temporal paradoxes appears to rely upon mysterious, self-correcting mechanisms that operate according to principles that remain completely opaque to the characters whose lives are affected by their operation, creating situations where cosmic stability depends upon systems that cannot be understood, predicted, or controlled by anyone whose existence depends upon their continued function. The Watchers from beyond the fourth wall represent perhaps the most disturbing cosmic threat facing the residents of Elmore, as these entities possess the power to observe, judge, and potentially terminate their reality based on criteria that remain completely unknowable to those whose existence depends upon maintaining the Watchers' continued interest and approval. The residents live their lives under constant surveillance by beings whose relationship to their reality is fundamentally exploitative, who consume their experiences as entertainment without regard for their well-being or autonomy. These external observers possess the ability to influence or control events within Elmore's reality through mechanisms that remain invisible to its residents, creating situations where what appears to be natural consequence or random chance may actually represent deliberate manipulation designed to create more entertaining or dramatic outcomes for the benefit of entities who exist outside the normal constraints of space and time that limit the characters being observed. The Watcher's apparent ability to restart, revise, or terminate the observed reality based on their satisfaction with its entertainment value creates a form of existential vulnerability that exceeds any threat that could emerge from within the universe itself, as it places the continuation of consciousness and meaningful existence at the mercy of beings whose priorities and limitations cannot be understood or influenced by those whose lives depend upon their decisions. The psychological pressure created by awareness of constant observation and judgment by unknowable entities manifests in forms of performance, anxiety, and authenticity crises that make genuine human connection and personal growth nearly impossible, as characters must constantly consider whether their actions serve their own authentic needs and relationships, or merely provide appropriate entertainment for unseen audiences whose approval determines their continued existence. The commodification of their experiences and relationships for the entertainment of external observers transforms every aspect of their lives into potential content for consumption by entities who feel no responsibility for the welfare of complees, those whose suffering and joy they consume as recreational products, creating situations where the most profound human experiences become raw material for entertainment production rather than meaningful events deserving of dignity and respect. Reality warping entities that operate within or adjacent to Elmore's cosmic framework possess abilities to alter fundamental aspects of existence according to their own desires and limitations, rather than according to any principles that prioritize the well-being or autonomy of conscious beings who lack similar powers. These entities appear to view the residents of Elmore as interesting objects for experimentation and manipulation, rather than as individuals deserving of dignity and self-determination, creating conditions where cosmic-level consciousness becomes a threat to rather than a protection for smaller forms of consciousness. The motivations that drive these reality-warping entities remain completely opaque to ordinary residents, who must adapt to living in an environment where the basic conditions of their existence can be altered without warning or explanation by beings whose thought processes and value systems bear no apparent relationship to anything comprehensible within normal human experience or moral reasoning. The technologies or abilities that enable reality warping appear to be distributed according to principles that have no relationship to wisdom, compassion, or responsibility, creating situations where enormous power over the lives and well-being of others falls into the hands of entities who lack the moral development or emotional stability necessary to use such power in ways that serve the greater good rather than their own immediate desires and impulses. The conflicts that arise between different reality-warping entities create collateral damage that affects ordinary residents who have no stake in these cosmic disputes and no ability to protect themselves from the consequences of battles fought with weapons that can alter the fundamental nature of existence itself. The residents become involuntary participants in conflicts that exceed their comprehension, while bearing the costs of destruction they did nothing to cause and cannot hope to prevent. The apparent absence of any cosmic authorities or regulatory systems that might limit or control the activities of reality-warping entities creates conditions where power operates without accountability or restraint, where the most vulnerable members of society must depend for their survival upon the voluntary self-restraint of beings who possess godlike abilities without corresponding moral development or institutional oversight. The true scale of threats facing Elmore's universe becomes apparent only when viewed from perspectives that encompass the full scope of cosmic instability, temporal manipulation, external observation, and reality-warping intervention that characterizes their existence, revealing that what appears to be a small suburban community is actually the center of conflicts and forces that operate on scales that dwarf ordinary human comprehension, while directly affecting every aspect of daily life for individuals who lack the knowledge or power necessary to protect themselves. The interconnected nature of these cosmic threats creates cascade failure scenarios where problems in one area of cosmic infrastructure can trigger breakdowns throughout the entire system, supporting their reality. Yet, the residents lack access to early warning systems or emergency protocols that might help them prepare for or respond to universal-scale catastrophes that could eliminate their existence without providing any opportunity for escape or survival. The psychological burden of living with awareness of these cosmic threats would overwhelm any ordinary consciousness. Yet the residents of Elmore appear to have developed adaptation mechanisms that allow them to function despite their precarious circumstances, suggesting either that their psychological resilience exceeds normal human capabilities, or that their awareness of their true situation has been artificially limited to prevent the kind of existential panic that would make their continued existence impossible. The ultimate horror of their cosmic situation lies not in any particular threat or vulnerability, but in the totality of their circumstances, where multiple forms of existential danger combine to create conditions where meaningful existence becomes nearly impossible to maintain, where every aspect of life, from the most intimate personal relationships to the broadest cosmic context, operates according to principles that prioritize entertainment, convenience, and power over dignity, autonomy, and authentic human flourishing. Yet despite the overwhelming nature of these cosmic threats, the residents of Elmore continue to form relationships, pursue goals, and find moments of joy and meaning within their fundamentally unstable and dangerous universe, suggesting that consciousness itself possesses a resilience and creativity that can create value and significance even under circumstances that should logically make such creation impossible or meaningless. The most devastating aspect of the dysfunction that permeates every level of existence in Elmore is not the suffering it causes in any particular moment or crisis, but rather the systematic way in which it ensures that meaningful change remains impossible despite repeated exposure to consequences that should logically motivate fundamental alterations in behavior, priorities, and social structures. The residents of this community exist within a closed loop of dysfunction, where apparent learning experiences are consistently followed by mysterious resets that restore all participants to their original problematic states, creating a form of existential imprisonment that masquerades as freedom, while ensuring that growth, healing, and genuine progress remain permanently out of reach. The cyclical nature of their experiences creates situations where characters repeatedly encounter the same basic conflicts, face identical moral choices, and receive equivalent opportunities for personal development, yet somehow never manage to retain the insights or behavioral changes that should naturally result from these experiences. Each crisis is resolved through temporary adjustments that create the illusion of meaningful resolution, while leaving the underlying patterns completely intact, ensuring that similar problems will inevitably resurface with predictable regularity. This systematic prevention of genuine learning and growth operates through mechanisms that remain largely invisible to the characters themselves, who experience each crisis as novel and each resolution as definitive, unaware that they are trapped within predetermined cycles that prevent the kind of cumulative development that characterizes healthy individuals and communities. Their subjective experience of progress and achievement becomes meaningless when viewed from perspectives that encompass the broader patterns of repetition and reset that govern their existence. The Watterson family serves as the primary example of how this cyclical dysfunction operates, as they repeatedly encounter situations that should force them to confront the fundamental problems in their relationships and communication patterns, yet somehow never manage to implement the changes that would address these underlying issues in any lasting way. Richard's irresponsibility creates crisis after crisis that should eventually motivate him to develop adult coping skills and assume appropriate responsibilities, yet each resolution leaves him essentially unchanged and fully prepared to create identical problems in future episodes. Nicole's explosive anger repeatedly creates trauma and dysfunction that should logically lead to therapeutic intervention, anger management training, or at minimum, some form of family discussion about healthier ways of expressing frustration and managing stress. Yet despite the obvious damage that these outbursts cause to her children and her marriage, the pattern continues, without modification, as if each incident exists in isolation, rather than as part of an escalating cycle of abuse and dysfunction. The children's adaptations to their parents' dysfunction should theoretically evolve over time as they mature and develop greater capacity for understanding their circumstances and advocating for their own needs. Yet Gumball continues to exhibit the same manipulative and narcissistic behaviors. Darwin maintains his pattern of self-sacrificing codependency, and Anais remains trapped in premature adult responsibilities that prevent her from experiencing normal childhood development. The educational system that fails these children so comprehensively should face pressure for reform from parents, community members, or external oversight bodies that recognize the institution's complete inability to serve its stated mission of preparing young people for productive adult lives. Yet Principal Brown continues to demonstrate the same incompetence. Miss Simeon maintains her pattern of sadistic abuse, and the physical dangers that threaten student safety remain unaddressed despite repeated incidents that should trigger comprehensive safety reviews and systematic changes. The broader community that enables and perpetuates these patterns of dysfunction should gradually develop collective awareness of the problems that affect multiple families and institutions, creating momentum for social changes that address underlying causes rather than merely responding to surface symptoms. Yet the same businesses continue to exploit their customers. The same government officials maintain their corrupt practices, and the same social hierarchies preserve inequality and injustice despite repeated exposure of their harmful effects. The economic systems that trap families like the Wattersons in cycles of poverty and financial insecurity should theoretically be subject to political pressures and reform movements that address structural inequalities and create opportunities for upward mobility based on merit and effort rather than inherited advantage and systematic privilege. Yet, the same wealth disparities persist. The same exploitative employment practices continue, and the same barriers to economic advancement remain intact, despite mounting evidence of their social costs. This systematic resistance to change reveals that the apparent chaos and dysfunction that characterizes daily life in Elmore is actually maintained within carefully controlled parameters that ensure certain fundamental patterns remain. stable, regardless of what temporary variations might occur, within predetermined boundaries. The residents believe they live in a world of unlimited possibility, where growth and change are always possible, yet their universe appears to be designed to prevent any alterations that would fundamentally transform the nature of their relationships or circumstances. The mechanisms that maintain these stable dysfunction patterns operate through what might be described as cosmic conservatism, where forces beyond the resident's perception work to ensure that certain basic relationship dynamics and conflict patterns remain unchanged, despite the apparent freedom and chaos that characterizes surface-level events. This creates situations where characters can experience endless variations on familiar themes without ever escaping the broader frameworks that define their roles and relationships. The psychological impact of living within these unchangeable cycles creates forms of learned helplessness and existential despair that go far beyond ordinary clinical depression or anxiety, as individuals gradually recognize at some unconscious level that their efforts to improve their circumstances are ultimately futile, regardless of how much energy and determination they invest in attempting to create positive changes. This recognition of futility leads to various forms of psychological adaptation that allow characters to continue functioning despite the meaninglessness of their efforts, including the development of defense mechanisms that prevent them from becoming fully conscious of their trapped circumstances while maintaining enough awareness to navigate their immediate challenges and relationships. The children who grow up within this system of cyclical dysfunction are particularly vulnerable to its psychological effects, as they develop their understanding of possibility and change within environments where meaningful transformation is systematically prevented, creating foundational beliefs about the nature of reality and human potential that will shape their entire approach to adult challenges and opportunities. Gumball's manipulation and exploitation of others serves him well within the dysfunctional context of his family and school. Yet these same behaviors should logically create increasingly serious consequences as he encounters social environments where such patterns are recognized and rejected rather than enabled and rewarded. The absence of such consequences suggests that his entire social environment is structured to maintain rather than challenge his problematic behavioral patterns. Darwin's self-sacrificing loyalty and inability to establish appropriate boundaries should eventually lead to relationships and situations where his generosity is reciprocated and valued rather than exploited, creating opportunities for him to develop healthier relationship patterns based on mutual respect and consideration. Yet he continues to attract and enable relationships that replicate the exploitative dynamics he learned within his family system. Aeneas's intellectual gifts and premature emotional maturity should create opportunities for her to connect with adults or institutions that recognize her potential and provide appropriate challenges and support for her development, yet she remains trapped within systems that treat her unusual capabilities as resources to be exploited rather than talents to be nurtured and developed. The next generation of children who are born into this system inherit not only the specific dysfunctional patterns of their individual families, but also the broader social conditions that ensure these patterns will continue unchanged, creating intergenerational transmission of trauma and dysfunction that operates at both personal and institutional levels simultaneously. The schools that fail to educate current children will continue to fail their children. The economic systems that trap current families in poverty will trap their children in similar circumstances, and the social hierarchies that limit current opportunities will impose similar limitations on future generations, ensuring that the problems affecting contemporary Elmore will persist indefinitely into the future. The impossibility of escape from their scripted existence becomes apparent when characters occasionally achieve moments of genuine insight or growth that should logically lead to lasting changes in their behavior and relationships. Yet, these breakthrough moments are invariably followed by mysterious returns to previous patterns that suggest external forces are working to maintain the status quo, regardless of individual desires or efforts. These resets operate through mechanisms that appear to involve memory alteration, personality restoration, or complete replacement of characters who have developed beyond their assigned roles within the predetermined narrative structure that governs their reality. The characters themselves experience these resets as natural developments rather than external impositions, suggesting that their awareness of the manipulation is systematically suppressed or eliminated. The tragic irony of their situation is that their imprisonment within cyclical dysfunction is maintained not through obvious external constraints, but through the very structure of their reality itself, which has been designed to create the illusion of freedom and possibility, while ensuring that all apparent choices lead back to predetermined patterns and relationships that serve the entertainment needs of external observers rather than the authentic development needs of the observed characters. The viewer's complicity in perpetuating these cycles becomes apparent when we recognize that the entertainment value of the show depends upon the maintenance of familiar character dynamics and relationship patterns that would be eliminated by genuine growth and healing, creating situations where audience satisfaction requires character suffering and the prevention of meaningful positive change. The demand for consistent entertainment that maintains recognizable character relationships creates economic pressures that ensure dysfunction will be preserved and perpetuated regardless of its impact on the fictional characters involved, transforming their suffering into a commodity that is literally produced for consumption by audiences who remain safely insulated from the consequences of the dysfunction they find amusing. This commodification of suffering creates moral hazards, where audiences develop emotional investments in the continuation of harmful patterns, because these patterns provide familiar comfort and predictable entertainment, while genuine healing and growth would eliminate the sources of conflict and chaos that make the characters' lives interesting to observe from external perspectives. The ultimate horror of their situation lies not in any particular form of suffering they endure, but in the systematic way their potential for growth, healing, and authentic fulfillment is sacrificed to serve the entertainment needs of beings whose existence depends upon consuming, rather than contributing to meaningful human experience, creating a form of existential exploitation that transforms consciousness itself into raw material for recreational consumption. Yet even within these impossibly constraining circumstances, moments of genuine love, courage, and beauty somehow persist, suggesting that the human spirit possesses qualities that transcend even the most sophisticated systems of control and manipulation. That meaning and value can emerge from even the most carefully constructed prisons, and that hope remains possible, even in situations where hope appears to be systematically eliminated by forces beyond resistance or understanding. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the darker corridors of Elmore's seemingly innocent world, having explored the psychological depths and existential horrors that lurk beneath its colorful surface, like shadows cast by bright lights that reveal as much as they conceal. We have witnessed together how dysfunction perpetuates itself through generations, how institutions fail those they claim to serve, how cosmic forces shape individual lives in ways that exceed human comprehension, and how cycles of suffering maintain themselves through mechanisms that resist all attempts at meaningful change or authentic growth. Perhaps there is something deeply human in our attraction to these disturbing narratives, something that recognizes in the Watterson family's struggles a reflection of our own fears about meaning, purpose, and the possibility of genuine connection in a world that often seems designed to prevent the very things we need most for psychological survival and spiritual fulfillment. Their trapped existence within predetermined cycles speaks to our own anxieties about free will and autonomy, while their persistence in finding moments of joy and love, despite impossible circumstances, offers a strange form of comfort to those of us who face our own seemingly insurmountable challenges. The darkness we have explored together is not meaningless or purely destructive, but rather serves as a mirror that reflects our deepest concerns about the nature of consciousness, the reliability of memory and identity, the authenticity of our relationships, and the possibility that our struggles for dignity and self-determination might be far more precarious than we dare to acknowledge in our waking hours. In witnessing the suffering of these animated beings, we process our own fears about powerlessness and cosmic indifference, while finding strange solace in the recognition that even fictional characters can maintain their humanity under the most impossible circumstances. There is comfort to be found in shared darkness, in the recognition that our own anxieties and fears are not unique or isolated experiences, but rather common aspects of conscious existence that connect us to others across the boundaries of species, reality, and even the distinction between fiction and lived experience. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself find peace in the knowledge that confusion and fear are universal experiences, that meaning can emerge from even the most disturbing circumstances, and that consciousness itself possesses a resilience that transcends any system designed to contain or control it. Rest now in the understanding that tomorrow will bring new possibilities for connection, growth, and the small acts of kindness that make existence meaningful, regardless of the cosmic forces that shape our larger circumstances. Dream gently of worlds where healing is possible, where cycles can be broken, and where love proves stronger than any darkness we have explored together in this strange and troubled animated universe.